The snow beneath my broken body was turning red. I know that because I could feel it, the warmth spreading outward from where my skull had met the stone, seeping into the white cold around me like ink dropped into water. Strange how something so violent could look so quiet from the inside. Strange how dying felt almost like falling asleep. My sister stood at the edge of the cliff above me. I could not see her anymore. My vision had narrowed to a circle of pale gray sky, ringed by the dark silhouettes of pine branches heavy with snow. But I knew she was still there. I knew because I could feel her eyes on me. That particular weight I had grown up beneath. The pressure of being watched and found wanting, or worse, found to be too much. She did not call my name. She did not climb down. She watched until she was satisfied, and then I heard her footsteps moving away through the snow, steady and unhurried, the way you walk when you have just crossed something off a list. My name is Riven. I am 22 years old. My sister tried to kill me tonight. And in the last moment before the darkness closed over me completely, before the cold finished what the fall had started, I smelled something I had never smelled before. Cedar and thunderstorm. Something wild and ancient and searingly alive. A scent that had no business being in this forest, in this moment, in the last seconds of my life. And then a hand pressed against my throat, 2 fingers searching for the pulse I was not sure I still had. Someone had come. I did not know yet whether that would save me or not. But I held on to that scent like a rope in the dark, and I stopped letting go. That was the end. This is where it began. The morning had started the way most of my mornings started, alone and early, before the rest of the Silver Creek pack house woke to its noise and its politics, and its careful hierarchies. I had learned long ago that the hours before dawn belonged to no one, and so they belonged to me. I dressed in the dark, pulling on my heaviest cloak against the December cold, tucking my collecting bag under my arm. The corridor outside my room was quiet. My sister's door was closed. I moved past it softly, not out of courtesy exactly, but out of the particular careful habit you develop when you have spent your whole life trying not to take up too much space. The forest in winter was a different world than the forest in summer. Everything was stripped down to its essential shape, the bones of trees made visible, the ground silenced under its white blanket. I loved it in a way I had never been able to properly explain to anyone. The clarity of it, the way nothing could hide. You could see exactly what everything was. I was an hour into my collecting when I found the wolf pup. He was caught in a steel trap set by one of the human hunters, who occasionally pushed too far into pack territory. The trap had closed on his left front leg, not fully. Not enough to sever, but enough to hold him fast, and enough to have torn the skin badly. He had been there long enough that the snow around him was disturbed in a wide circle from his struggling, and his small body had gone still in the way animals go still when they have exhausted hope but not yet exhausted life. He was perhaps 4 months old. His fur was the color of winter bark, gray and brown and pale at the throat. He looked up at me when I crouched beside him. His yellow eyes were terrified and very young. "I know," I told him quietly. "I know. Hold still." I had learned herbalism the way I learned most things, by reading every book in my father's study that no one else wanted to read, and by paying attention to the world more carefully than was perhaps strictly necessary. I knew which plants still held potency under snow. I knew which barks could be rendered into a paste that would slow bleeding and dull pain. I worked the trap mechanism with fingers that had gone numb from cold, talking to him softly the whole time. Not about anything important, just sound, just the reassurance of a voice that was not going to hurt him. When the trap released and he lunged forward instinctively, I caught him before he could run on the damaged leg and bring himself to further harm. I tore a strip from the lining of my cloak, which was warm wool and softer than anything else I had on me. I bound his leg. I held him against my chest until his trembling slowed. No one saw me do any of this. There was no one to see. When I set him down and he limped forward, testing the leg, and then turned back to look at me with those yellow eyes still wide and serious, I felt the particular quiet satisfaction of having done something that needed doing. Not because anyone would know, not because anyone would thank me. Because he was small and hurt and the world was cold, and I had the means to help. I watched him disappear between the trees. I hoped he would find his way back to wherever his family was. I turned back toward home. I did not know then that I was already counting down the last hours of my life as I had known it. My father, Aldrich, was Silver Creek Pax Alpha, and he was a man who loved his daughters. I have never doubted that. I want to say it plainly before I say anything else, because the rest of what I have to say about him is complicated, and the complication is easier to understand if you first understand that the love was real. He loved us. He was simply not very good at hiding which of us he loved more easily. It was not intentional. That was what made it so impossible to argue with, so impossible to even name without sounding petty. When Aldrich looked at Cressida, he saw his heir, his capable eldest, the daughter who was organized and strategic and would serve the pack well. When he looked at me, something in his face just lit up, and no one, including him, had ever been able to explain precisely why. I was not cleverer than Cressida. I was not a better warrior. I was not more useful to the pack in any quantifiable way, but his face lit up and hers did not. And 22 years of that small repeated fact had built something inside my sister that I had spent most of my life trying not to look at directly. That morning, he was already in the main hall when I returned, speaking with the pack elders about the visiting delegation that had arrived the previous evening from 3 territories to the east. I had barely cleared the entrance when he turned and his face did the thing it always did. "There she is," he said, and his voice carried the particular warmth that Cressida had once described when she thought I could not hear her, as the voice he saves for you. She was standing in the upper corridor. I saw her before I saw anyone else, the way you always see the thing you are most worried about first. She was dressed for the day already, her dark hair precisely arranged, her posture perfect. She was watching our father's face as he looked at me. Then she looked at me. The expression she wore lasted only a moment before she smoothed it away. But I had learned to read her the way you learn to read weather, by watching small changes before they become storms. And what I saw in that moment was not anger exactly. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a losing battle for so long that they have stopped believing the battle was ever fair. "Father was asking for you," she said, her voice entirely neutral. "The delegation wants to meet both of us before the formal welcome. He suggested you lead the greeting." I opened my mouth. Then I closed it. There was nothing I could say. If I protested, if I suggested Cressida lead instead, she would hear it as pity. which was worse than the original insult. If I agreed without comment, I was simply doing what our father had already decided. I was the picture hung on the wall that everyone admired without asking who built the frame. Of course, I said. She was already walking away. The news came at the midday meal, spreading through the pack the way all significant news spreads, person to person, gaining weight with each retelling until by the time it reached me across the long oak table, it carried the gravity of a proclamation. Alpha King Theron of the Blood Moon Pack was seeking a Luna. He was, by all accounts, visiting neighboring packs before the new moon, 27 days hence. He would make his selection. Whichever pack's daughter he chose would stand beside the most powerful alpha in the territory as his mate and queen. I watched Cressida receive this information. She was seated 3 places down from me, beside our mother Marin, and I saw the moment the words landed. She went very still. Her fork set down against her plate with a precision that was almost gentle. Then she looked up, and her eyes found me across the table before they found anyone else, and the look in them was something I had no name for, something with too many components to reduce to a single word. I looked away first. I always looked away first. It felt like the only kindness available to me. I did not understand then how close we were to the edge of things. I had spent so many years watching Cressida's resentment build without breaking that I had begun to believe it never would, that this was simply the shape of our lives, imperfect and painful, but stable. A wound that had scarred over rather than healed properly. I had been wrong about the scarring. It was still bleeding underneath. She came to my room that evening just after the sun had finished setting, when the cold had deepened and the first new snow of the night was beginning to fall. I heard her knock, 2 soft taps, and something in the rhythm of it was different enough from her usual manner that I sat up from my reading with a feeling I could not immediately identify. "Come in," I said. She opened the door, and she was wearing her winter cloak already, the deep blue one she had owned since she was 17. Her expression was softer than I had seen it in months. The tension around her jaw relaxed, the careful armor slightly lowered. "I thought we could walk," she said, "to our spot, like we used to." Our spot was the cliff overlooking the valley to the east of Silver Creek territory, a place we had gone as children to watch the sun set in summer and the storms build in winter. We had not gone together in years. I felt something leap in my chest that I recognized afterward as hope, which is a dangerous thing to feel when you are already standing too close to a cliff. "It is cold," I said. Not as an objection, just observationally. "I know." The corner of her mouth moved. "We were always cold up there. Do you remember how we used to argue about who had to be on the windward side?" I remembered. I remembered it exactly. I was already reaching for my cloak. We walked through the forest in a silence that felt almost companionable. Our breath making twin clouds in the dark air, our boots finding the familiar path by memory more than sight. The trees were close and old here, massive pines whose branches held the snow above us like a ceiling, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional soft collapse of a loaded branch somewhere deeper in the dark. I kept waiting for her to tell me what this was about. She did not. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the path ahead, and for a while I let myself believe that this was enough, that perhaps she had simply wanted company, that perhaps something had softened in her without my noticing. I was still believing this when we reached the cliff. The valley spread below us, vast and white, the frozen river cutting through it like a seam in pale cloth. The sky was heavy with cloud, the stars hidden, and the darkness had a particular quality to it, thick and pressing, the way it gets before a storm. They were talking today, Cressida said from just behind me, about Alpha King Theron. I kept my eyes on the valley. I know. I heard. They said he will choose the most beautiful daughter in the territory. Her voice was very flat, very even. They said your name, Riven. They always say your name. Cressida. I turned to face her. I don't want any of this. You know that. I have never wanted to be anyone's choice or anyone's symbol. If you want to be presented to him, tell Father. He would listen to you. He respects your judgment. Don't. Her voice cracked on the word, just slightly, and she shut it back down immediately. Don't do that. Don't pretend you don't understand what I'm saying. Then tell me what you're saying. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw it then. The thing I had been refusing to see for years, how deep the wound went, how far past jealousy it had traveled, into something that had altered the actual shape of who she was. She was not angry. She was bereft. She had been bereaved of something she felt was hers, something taken not by malice, but by the simple, indifferent fact of my existence. I am tired, she said very quietly. I am so tired of living in a story where I am not the one who matters. You matter. My voice came out almost steady. Cressida, you matter to me. You are my sister. If we could just talk about this, really talk about it, we could. There is nothing to talk about. She had gone very still. The way she went still at the dinner table, that same terrible quiet. There is only this. I saw her hand move. I did not understand it, not at first, not even as I felt the pressure of her palms against my sternum, because my mind could not translate what was happening into something real. My sister's hands, my sister's face, not twisted with rage, but calm, so calm. The edge of the cliff was very close behind me. I had been standing with my back to the valley. In the single stretched second before I fell, I thought, she planned this. She brought me here knowing exactly where I was standing, the warmth of her hands in the cold night, the soft voice and the old cloak and the memory of arguing about the windward side. She had planned all of it. Then there was nothing but air and cold, and the rushing darkness and the brutal, staggering impact of stone rising up to meet me, and a pain so total that it erased everything else, every thought, every question, every word I had not finished saying. Then there was only the snow. I became aware of things in pieces, the way you assemble a broken thing after the fact, fragment by fragment. The cold first. Not just air cold, but the deep cold of extended exposure, the kind that gets inside your joints and persuades them they have forgotten how to move. Then the pain, which was also deep, centered in my skull and radiating outward, with secondary notes from somewhere in my ribcage that made each shallow breath a negotiation. Then sound. Wind in the pines above me, something moving in the branches, the soft cough of disturbed snow, the settling quiet of a night that did not know or care that something terrible had happened in it. Then smell. This was what kept me from surrendering to the dark a second time, because it did not belong here, in this cold ravine, beside this frozen river. It was cedar and thunderstorm and something beneath those things, something older and more fundamental, something that bypassed my conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to the animal part of me, the wolf who lived inside my human skin, the wolf who, even now, even in this broken moment, lifted her head. A presence, close, warmth radiating from something large and alive, crouching beside me in the snow. Then 2 fingers pressed against the side of my throat, searching with focused precision for the pulse that was there, faint and irregular, but stubbornly present. I could not open my eyes. I could not speak. I could barely breathe, but I was aware of him, this stranger in the darkness, with his impossible scent of storms, and I was aware of the moment he found my pulse, because I felt the change in him, the tension in his body shifting from desperate searching into something that was not quite relief, not quiet enough to be relief. More like a man who has been bracing for one outcome and received another, and has not yet decided what to do with the difference. "She's alive," he said, very low. "Alpha." Another voice, further back, cautious. "We should consider the implications. If she dies in our territory, Silver Creek will have grounds to—" "She won't die." The certainty in those 2 words was absolute, not a hope, not an intention, a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had clearly spent years speaking things into being simply by saying them with sufficient conviction. I felt myself being lifted, carefully, with a steadiness that did not waver even when I made an involuntary sound at the movement of my ribs. He adjusted his hold immediately, redistributing my weight with a precision that spoke of someone who had carried injured things before and knew exactly how much pressure was too much. The cedar and thunderstorm scent enveloped me completely. My wolf, battered and terrified, and very far from anything she understood, did one thing. She exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath for 22 years and had only just now been given a reason to stop. I let the dark take me again, but this time it was different. This time, underneath all the pain and the cold and the impossible weight of what my sister had done, there was something else. Something I had no name for yet. Something that felt, against all reason, like the beginning of something rather than the end. Day 5. That was what he told me later, when I was coherent enough to understand the information and hold it in sequence with everything else, to file it in its proper place in the story of what had happened to me. He had found me on the 5th day after the fall. 5 days of lying in that ravine while the snow accumulated around me with the patient indifference of nature, which does not distinguish between a sleeping thing and a dead one. 5 days of my parents grieving. 5 days of Cressida walking around in the space my absence had made, arranging things to her liking. I had no memory of those 5 days. I have tried, in the quiet hours since, to reach back into that gap and find something, any fragment of sensation or half-formed dream, any evidence that some part of me had been present and registering the world, even while the rest of me was somewhere else entirely. But there is nothing there, just a clean absence, a cut in the fabric of time, before and after with silence in between. What I know of those 5 days, I know from him. This is how Theron found me. He had been in the forest for 4 days already, running the annual winter hunt he had maintained since taking the Alpha King's title 5 years prior, inherited from his father, along with everything else his father left behind when the rogue attack claimed him. A week away from Blood Moon Packlands. Away from the council that convened in his reception hall 3 times a week with their careful faces and their carefully worded concerns about succession and stability and the pressing necessity of a Luna. Away from the particular loneliness of being surrounded at all times by people whose loyalty was real, but whose knowledge of him was limited to the version of himself he was required to present. Out here in the old-growth forest with Bastion at his back and 6 trusted trackers moving through the trees ahead, he was something simpler. A wolf following ancient instincts. A man remembering what it felt like to want something uncomplicated. He had been tracking a large elk since first light on the 4th morning, moving east through territory that bordered Silver Creek's lands when the wind shifted. He told me his wolf did not ask permission. He was running before he had made the decision to run, breaking hard to the left through the dense pine while Bastion called after him and the trackers scrambled to follow. He told me the sound in his head during those minutes was unlike anything he had experienced before or since. Low and continuous and absolutely certain. His wolf narrating something in a language that preceded words, that preceded thought, that went all the way back to whatever wolves were before they learned to walk on 2 legs and call themselves men. He crested a small rise and saw me below. Silver hair spread dark against the white snow, the red spreading wide around me. The terrible stillness of a body that has used up everything it had and is now simply waiting for whatever comes next. He told me something happened to his chest in that moment that he still, even now, did not have adequate language for. Something like a door being forced open in a room that had been sealed so long the room itself had forgotten what doors were for. He came down the rise fast, crouched beside me, pressed 2 fingers to the side of my throat with the focused precision of someone who has done field triage in worse conditions than this and knows exactly where to find a pulse. He found it, thin as a thread, stretched nearly to breaking, but continuous. "She's alive," he said. Bastion arrived behind him, breathing hard from the sprint, and to his credit, he did not say, "I told you so," or ask why they were there, or question the impulse that had brought them. He simply assessed the situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent years managing the consequences of his alpha's instincts, and then he raised the single practical concern that needed raising. Alpha. She's Silver Creek. If she dies in our territory, we're looking at a diplomatic situation that the Council will be discussing for the next 3 years. Theron was already gathering me into his arms. He told me afterward that he had noticed, lifting me, how light I was. Not just the natural lightness of a woman smaller than him, but the particular lightness of someone who has been reduced, who has had something taken from them by violence and cold, and days without warmth. He said I felt fragile in a way that made something in him go very quiet and very focused, the way he went quiet and focused before something that mattered. "There's a hunting cabin 2 miles north," he said. "We'll take her there." He did not look back. The cabin was his grandfather's originally, built 3 generations ago when the Blood Moon hunting grounds extended further east than they did now, maintained through the years as a shelter for exactly this kind of situation, extended hunts, injuries, weather that turned faster than expected. It was small and solid and very old, the kind of structure built without any consideration of appearance, because the people who built it needed walls, and a roof, and heat, and nothing else. He laid me on the bed. Bastion built the fire. Theron sent the rest of the hunting party back to Blood Moon Packlands with instructions to report that the Alpha King had extended his expedition and was tracking something important and would return in his own time. Then he worked. He had learned field medicine during the rogue wars of his early reign, 3 years of sporadic border conflict that had cost him people he valued, and taught him things he would rather not know. He cleaned the wound on my skull with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be given the circumstances. He stitched it with a precision that Bastian, watching from the doorway, described later as unnerving. He wrapped my ribs with strips of cloth torn from the cleanest material available, binding them firmly enough to support the breaks without restricting the shallow breathing that was all I could manage. Every touch felt like it cost him something. Bastian told me this later, in the way that careful touches cost something when you are trying not to hurt a thing further and are aware at every moment of how easily you could. When the fever came that night, he did not leave. He replaced cool cloths against my forehead as they warmed, iced them in the snow outside the back door, and returned over and over through the hours of the night. He forced willow bark tea between my lips in small amounts, coaxing my body to take what it needed to fight the infection that had moved in behind the trauma. He sat beside the bed in the chair he had pulled close, and he talked to me, quietly, steadily. A low, continuous narration about nothing in particular. About the forest outside and the quality of the snow and the elk they had been tracking and never caught. About his grandfather who had built this cabin with his own hands over a single winter. About the particular way the light came through the trees at dawn in this part of the world. He told me these things as if I could hear them, as if the sound of his voice was medicine in its own right, which perhaps it was. Underneath all of it, threaded through the practical details like a current beneath water, was a single word he kept returning to without seeming to notice he was doing it. Stay. Not a command, not even quite a request. Something more exposed than either. The word of a man who had found something in the snow that his hands recognized before his mind caught up, and who was not ready, not remotely ready, to let it go. Stay. I heard it somewhere below consciousness, in whatever part of me was still present and receiving during those lost days. I have thought about that since, about the fact that it reached me, about what it means that of all the things that could have called me back from the edge of whatever I was standing at the edge of, it was a stranger's voice saying a single word in the dark. On the third night, I dreamed of Cressida. Not the Cressida of the cliff, the Cressida of before, the one who existed before the weight of comparison finished settling onto her, before whatever was growing in her had grown large enough to require action. She was braiding my hair the way she used to when we were children, her fingers quick and certain, and she was telling me a story about a wolf who could call down snow by howling at the right angle to the wind. And in the dream, the window was warm and the light was gold, and I was completely at ease in the way you can only be at ease in dreams, where the thing you are afraid of has not happened yet, and the thing you have lost is still present. Then I woke up, and the pain was there, and the memory was there, and the grief of those two things arriving together in the first second of consciousness was almost worse than either of them separately. Easy. The voice was immediate, low, carefully pitched to not startle. You're safe. You're in my hunting cabin. I've got you. I turned my head toward the voice, which cost me considerably, and expressed its objections through a spike of pain that started at the back of my skull and radiated forward. I found the source sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, forearms resting on his knees, watching me with an alertness that had clearly been there for some time. The first thing I registered was his eyes, amber, but not the thin golden amber of afternoon light through leaves. Deep amber, the color of dark honey held against firelight, warm and complex, capable of great heat and great stillness simultaneously. They were looking at me with an expression I could not immediately read, careful and contained, but with something underneath the containment that had edges, something that had been under pressure for a while. The second thing I registered was that he looked like a man who had not slept in several days and had decided that this was simply the current state of things and had moved forward accordingly. His face was all sharp angles, dark stubble shading toward a beard, dark hair somewhat too long at the collar. He was large in the specific way that very powerful things are large. Not just the dimension of him, but the quality of his presence in the room, the particular kind of stillness that belongs to things which do not need to make noise or movement to be felt. He was watching me, and whatever he was feeling, he had it contained to just this, just the amber eyes with their particular intensity. Just the set of his jaw. "Who are you?" My voice came out as barely a scrape of sound against the back of my throat. I tried again, slightly better. "Who are you?" "My name is Theron." He reached for the cup on the table beside the bed, slid one arm beneath my shoulders with a care so practiced and precise that it barely registered as movement before I was upright enough to drink. The water was cold and clean and felt, in the specific calculus of that moment, like the most meaningful thing I had ever experienced. He held the cup steady until I had taken enough, then lowered me back with the same careful economy. "I found you 5 days ago, just inside the Silver Creek eastern boundary. You were dying." 5 days. I lay still and let that settle into me alongside everything else that needed settling. Outside the small window, the winter light was thin and pale, and completely indifferent. Somewhere underneath the numbness that still had most of my body, my ribs reminded me of their condition with every shallow breath. A reliable metronomic ache that would become, over the coming days, as familiar as my own heartbeat. My sister. The words came out before I had decided to say them, the wound speaking ahead of the wound keeper. Cressida. The quality of Theron's attention changed. Not dramatically, not with any large external signal, just a tightening along the line of his jaw, a slight adjustment in the quality of the stillness he carried, the way a temperature changes before a storm arrives. "Is she the one who did this to you?" The reflex was there, the old trained impulse to soften, to qualify, to find a more generous framing. She was under enormous pressure. She was not herself. You have to understand the years of accumulated pain that led her to a single terrible moment. The reflex was there, and I felt it, and I let it go. "Yes," I said. The word felt like setting down something I had been carrying for much longer than 5 days. He stood and moved to the window, and I watched the line of his back and the particular quality of his stillness from there. Compressed. The stillness of something choosing not to be in motion, because the alternative would be large and difficult to contain. He stood for a moment looking out at the snow, and then he turned back to face me. "You're from Silver Creek," he said. "I recognize the territory." "Yes. I'm the Alpha King of Blood Moon Pack." He said it plainly, without preamble or emphasis, the way you state a fact that is simply true and requires no decoration. "This is my grandfather's hunting cabin. You've been here 3 days." The Alpha King. I had known this face, and this name would eventually resolve into the same person, the way two things seen separately in poor light eventually clarify into a single object when the light improves. Theron of Blood Moon, who had maintained 5 years of hard-won peace after his father's death, who had refused every Luna his council presented, who was now conducting a formal search for a mate before the new moon. The same new moon toward which Cressida had been carefully positioning herself since the moment she watched me stop moving at the bottom of a cliff. "I need to go home," I said. "My parents will think I'm dead." "You nearly were." He came back to the chair, sat again with that same unhurried economy of movement. Up close, I could see the specific quality of exhaustion in his face, with more clarity. The lines around his eyes that were not all from age. The shadows that spoke of nights spent sitting in this chair beside this bed, watching for changes in the breathing of a woman whose name he did not yet know. "Your skull was fractured, 3 ribs broken on the left side. You were in the snow for 5 days before I found you. You ran a fever for 3 days after that. I need to tell them the truth. You will?" His voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone threading a needle between urgency and restraint. "But not this week. You can barely sit up without the blood leaving your face. And if your sister went to the lengths she went to in order to remove you, we need to think carefully about what happens when she discovers you're still alive. She will try again." The thought arrived, complete and cold. Not as speculation, but as knowledge, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. "I know," I said. "I know she will." He was quiet for a moment, looking at me with an expression I still could not fully decode. Then, "What's your name?" "Riven." He said it quietly, almost to himself. The way you say something you are trying to learn the weight of. Just my name in his voice, and something about the simple fact of it. This man saying my name in this cabin where he had spent 3 nights keeping watch over a stranger made something shift behind my sternum that I chose not to examine too closely yet. "Rest," he said. "We'll figure out what needs to be figured out, but not today." I hated it, and he was right, and both of those things were true simultaneously, which is a particular kind of frustration that exhaustion makes worse. My parents were in Silver Creek Pack House believing their daughter was dead, and I was here, alive and healing and entirely unable to act on either of those facts. My body had made its own decision about the pace of things, and no amount of urgency on my part was going to renegotiate the terms, so I rested. Slowly, over the days that followed, I came to know the cabin the way you come to know any small space you are confined to, intimately and with a specificity that would seem excessive in any other context. The way the morning light came through the east-facing window at a low angle in winter and turned the rough wooden floor briefly golden before the clouds covered it. The particular sound the back door made when the temperature dropped. A small complaint from the frame that meant it was colder than the night before. The smell of the place, pine resin and old wood smoke, and something beneath those things that I eventually identified as the cedar and storm scent of Theron himself, so thoroughly woven into the air of the cabin by now that it had become part of the place's fundamental character. Bastian brought supplies from a settlement 3 hours north, arriving with firewood and food and a dry manner that communicated competence without warmth, though I came to understand over time that this was simply his register, not unfriendliness, but a particular kind of economy. The beta who had learned to preserve his energy for the things that actually needed it, He treated me with a careful courtesy that was neither warm nor cold, the provisional respect of a man withholding full judgment until he had enough information to form one. Theron was in the cabin more than not. When he was gone, tracking the perimeter, checking who might have ventured close to the area, I was aware of his absence as a specific quality of the air, a slightly different weight to the silence. When he was present, he did not hover or manage or perform attention, but he was always, in some quiet peripheral way, aware of where I was and how I was, and whether the quality of my breathing had changed. On the third day that I was properly conscious, when I could sit up without my vision going white at the edges and hold a cup of broth without my hands shaking excessively, we talked. Not about logistics, not about Cressida or plans or the approaching new moon. We talked the way people talk when the ordinary scaffolding of social interaction has been stripped away by circumstance, and there is nothing left to hide behind except the actual content of who you are. I told him about Cressida the way I had never told anyone about Cressida, without the editorial softening, without the careful construction of a narrative that protected everyone's dignity. I told him about the wolf pup we had found as children, the one she had worked so hard to nurse back to health, and how the pack remembered it afterward as something I had done. I told him about standing in corridors watching my father's face light up in ways it never quite lit up for her, and about the particular helplessness of knowing you were the cause of someone else's pain simply by existing in the form you existed in. I told him about the 22 years of careful stepping around, of stepping back, of offering to deflect compliments and decline opportunities, of trying to make myself smaller in every room we shared, and how none of it had been enough, because none of it addressed the actual problem, which was not my behavior, but my presence. He listened with complete attention, the kind of listening that is rare enough to be disorienting when you encounter it. He did not prepare his response while I was still speaking. He did not redirect toward himself or offer premature reassurance or rush to the resolution. He simply received what I was saying, all of it, and let it exist in the space between us without trying to resolve it before it was ready to be resolved. When I finished, the fire had burned down somewhat, and the light outside had shifted into the particular blue-gray of late winter afternoon. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 20 women were presented to me in the past year, all of them chosen for their suitability, all of them well-bred and well-spoken and carefully prepared for the encounter. He looked at the fire rather than at me. Not one of them made me want to know what they were afraid of. He looked at me then. You're here with a fractured skull and broken ribs, and I've been sitting in this chair for 3 days trying to figure out how to ask what you think about when you can't sleep. I held his gaze. The amber of his eyes in the firelight was very warm. I think about my mother, I said after a moment. The way she sits by the window when something is troubling her. She's sitting by a window right now somewhere, and I can't do anything about it. Something moved across his expression, brief and specific, a recognition of a particular kind of pain. I think about whether wanting justice and wanting Cressida to suffer are the same thing, I continued. Whether the fact that I want both makes me something I don't want to be. He considered this carefully, the way he considered everything, without rushing to the comfortable answer. They're the same thing, he said, in the first hours after someone tries to kill you. You're allowed to want both. You can decide what you actually want once you've survived long enough to have the luxury of distinguishing between them. The relief of that was larger than I expected. It was 3 days later that Bastian returned from a supply run with the news that changed everything. He came in from the cold stamping snow from his boots, set his pack down on the table, and had the expression of a man carrying information he had taken no pleasure in accumulating. He looked at Theron first, the beta-alpha communication of eyes that conveyed a summary before words were possible, and then he looked at me with something that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. "There's word from Silver Creek," he said. He told us what Cressida had reported. The rogue attack. Both daughters present. Riven taken, presumably dead. The search parties that had found nothing. No rogue scent trails. No evidence of a struggle consistent with her account. My father accepting the story because there was no other story available to him. My mother sitting by the window. He told us about the message that had arrived at Silver Creek from Blood Moon Pack, the formal announcement of Theron's search for a Luna, the requirement to present eligible daughters before the new moon. He told us that Aldrich was preparing to present Cressida, that Cressida had expressed her desire to honor her sister's memory by serving the alliance between packs. 16 days until the new moon. I pressed my hands flat against my knees and breathed carefully through the information, all of it, letting it arrange itself into a shape I could look at directly. Cressida had not just tried to kill me, she had built a new life on the architecture of my death. And she had done it with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything, leaving nothing to chance, accounting for every contingency. I had always known she was capable. I had simply never understood what she was capable of. "There's one more thing," Bastian said, and his voice had changed slightly, carrying a different quality of information now. "Someone in our own council has been making inquiries, asking questions about your whereabouts, Theron. Sending messages towards Silver Creek." He paused. "I don't have a name yet, but someone on Blood Moon's council does not want this hunt concluded on your terms." The room went quiet in a different way. Theron's expression did not change, but his stillness shifted quality, becoming the specific stillness of a man adding a new piece of information to a structure he was building in his mind and recalculating what the structure could bear. "Find the name," he said to Bastian quietly. "Already working on it." Theron stood then, and when he stood, the full weight of what he was became present and operational in a way that was simply a fact about him. The same way the height of a mountain is a fact, not something performed or claimed, just something that is. He paced once to the window and back, thinking. Then he turned to face me. "I have a proposal," he said. "You won't like all of it. Tell me." He laid it out simply and directly, the way he did everything. He would go to Silver Creek. He would play the expected role, the Alpha King in search of a Luna, evaluating candidates with appropriate seriousness. He would meet Cressida. He would give her every reason to believe that her plan had succeeded, that her positioning had worked, that the path to Luna Queen was clear and uncontested. Meanwhile, I would stay here. I would finish healing. Bastian would train me in whatever I was willing to learn. I would grow stronger and quieter and more certain, and I would wait. And when the ceremony was arranged, when Cressida was standing on a platform in front of representatives from both packs and every significant figure in the territory, certain that she had won, I would walk in. I would walk in, and I would end it. "You want to use me as bait," I said. "I want to give you a stage," he said, "with 500 witnesses. No private confrontation she can reframe. No accusation without corroboration. Her entire constructed story taken apart in front of every person whose opinion she has spent weeks carefully managing. He paused. I want to make it impossible for her to spin another version, and I want you to be the one who does it. I sat with this for a long moment. I thought about my mother by the window, my father's face stripped of its light, 16 days of grief built on a lie. I thought about walking into that ceremony on my own feet, in my own clothes, saying my own words, on terms I had chosen rather than terms that had been chosen for me. 3 conditions, I said. From near the doorway, Bastian made a sound I chose to interpret as respect. Theron waited, his amber eyes steady on mine. First, you tell me everything. Every conversation with Cressida, every gesture, every word. I need to know what she's doing while I'm here. I held his gaze. Second, when the truth comes out, my parents hear it from me. Not from messengers, not from your counsel, from me in person. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. Both. What's the third? I took a breath. The third condition required something different from the first 2. Less strategy and more exposure. The kind of courage that lives not in the body, but somewhere more undefended. Tell me the truth, I said. Is this only about justice? Or is there something else happening here that I should understand? The fire crackled quietly between us. Bastian found something of great interest to study outside the window. Theron looked at me, and the containment he carried so constantly, that careful layer of held-backness, did not disappear, but it became transparent in a way it had not been before, like glass cleared of fog, like something that had been waiting a long time for the right question. I smelled you before I saw you, he said. A quarter-mile out, in the dark, in the cold. Underneath the blood and the cold and everything else, I smelled something that had no business being in that part of the forest, and my wolf was running before I made the decision to run. He said this plainly, without drama or decoration. I have been Alpha King for 5 years. I have walked through rooms designed specifically to make me feel something about someone. I have met women chosen for exactly this purpose by people who know me well. He paused. Not once in 5 years did my wolf move. The fire settled. A log shifted. Outside, the snow continued its patient, indifferent work. When I found you, he said, something happened in my chest that I have been calling relief because it is the closest word I have, but it was not just relief. It was recognition. My wolf recognized you before I had any rational basis for recognizing anything. His voice was low and level and entirely without performance. The mate bond, yes, that is what this is. And I am not going to pretend it is only about justice, because it is not, Chishan. The word sat in the room with a weight that its size did not account for. My wolf, who had been patient and quiet and very still through this entire conversation, made a sound in the back of my awareness that was not a howl. Something quieter than that. Something more certain. Then we do this together, I said. He held out his hand across the space between us. I looked at it for a moment, at the steadiness of it, at the particular quality of patience it expressed, the hand of someone who would wait as long as the waiting required. Then I placed mine in it. The contact sent warmth moving up my arm that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the deep, resonant certainty of a thing clicking into the place it was always meant to occupy. My wolf went completely still, the way a searching thing goes still when it has finally found what it was looking for and can, at last, stop looking. His hand was warm and steady and held mine without gripping, without pressing, without asking for anything beyond the simple fact of contact, just present, just here, 16 days until the new moon. Outside the cabin, the snow continued to fall, covering the forest in patient white, covering tracks and evidence and the place in the ravine where I had lain broken and been found, covering everything indiscriminately the way snow does, making the world look clean and simple and unmarked from the outside. But underneath the snow, in the dark, cold soil, things were alive that the snow did not know about. Things that had been pushed down into the ground and had no intention of staying there. I was one of them. Day 12. Theron left at dawn. I stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched him go, which was something I had not planned to do and found myself doing anyway, standing in the cold rectangle of the open door with my arms folded against the chill, watching the point where the tree line swallowed him until there was nothing left to watch. He had dressed differently, not the worn hunting clothes of the past 12 days, but something more deliberate, more composed, the dark wool and clean lines of a man who was about to be looked at and knew it. He had his alpha king face on before he cleared the porch. I saw it settle into place the way a mask settles, not false exactly, but selective, the version of himself that the world was permitted to see. Before he stepped off the porch, he paused and turned back, and for one moment the mask was not quite in place yet. "I'll return before dark," he said. "I know." He looked at me for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he turned and walked into the trees, and the forest closed behind him, and he was gone. Bastian materialized from the side of the cabin where he had been giving us the specific privacy of someone pretending not to be nearby. "He'll be fine," he said, which was not what I had been thinking about, or perhaps was exactly what I had been thinking about, translated into the only language Bastian spoke in the mornings. "I know that too," I said. I went inside and closed the door, and stood in the cabin that smelled of cedar and old wood smoke and the particular resonance of 12 days of something building between two people in a small space. And I thought about Cressida receiving him, about the expression she would arrange on her face when Alpha King Theron of Blood Moon walked into Silver Creek Pack House looking like exactly what he was, about how carefully she had prepared for this moment, about how good she was at preparation. My sister had always been better at planning than I was. She thought 3 steps ahead where I thought 1. She anticipated responses and prepared for them before they arrived. These were the qualities that should have made her an extraordinary pack leader, and they were the qualities she had turned, with the precision of a gifted surgeon, toward my destruction. I was under no illusions about what Theron was walking into. "Teach me something," I said to Bastian. He looked at me for a moment, assessing. Then he set down his coffee and said, "How's your left side?" "Manageable." "That's not what I asked." "Teach me something," I repeated. He taught me something. We worked in the clearing behind the cabin for 2 hours that first morning, and I discovered things about my own body that surprised me, reflexes and instincts that had apparently been waiting patiently behind the careful, contained presentation I had spent my life constructing. I was not a fighter. I had no training, no foundation, nothing to build on except the raw material of a wolf who had been told all her life to stay quiet, and had stored up considerable energy in the process. Bastian was a patient teacher in the same way he was patient at everything, without warmth but without cruelty, corrective when I was wrong, and economical with praise when I was right. He taught me to fall without compounding injury. He taught me how to use the momentum of something larger than me against itself. He taught me that the throat, the eyes, and the inside of the knee were not large targets, but they were reliable ones. He also taught me on the third day to use my thigh pouch of medicinal herbs as something other than medicine. Powdered wolfsbane in the eyes, he said, demonstrating on empty air with a precision that suggested he had done this before. Buys you approximately 8 seconds. That is enough time to do one thing. Choose the one thing carefully. You're enjoying this, I said. I find competence satisfying, he said, regardless of its source. Theron returned that first evening as the light failed, coming through the back door with snow on his shoulders and an expression that was not quite what he had left with. Something compressed about his jaw, something that he was carrying carefully. He sat across from me at the table and told me everything. He had promised he would, and Theron, I had learned, kept his word. With the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything else. Silver Creek Pack House was in formal mourning. Black wool on the door frames. My father aged a decade since Theron had seen him at the last territorial council, the grief sitting on him like physical weight. My mother barely present in the room, answering questions in monosyllables, her eyes finding the window at every opportunity, as if she was watching for something she could not name but could not stop expecting. And Cressida, he described her with the same careful accuracy he used for everything, without editorializing, without performing disgust for my benefit. She had been perfect. That was the word he used, and hearing it from him, applied to her, in the context of what she had done, created a sensation in my chest that was not quite pain and not quite fury, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. She had been dressed simply, which was a calculation. She had spoken of me constantly, which was a calculation. She had let grief show in carefully measured amounts, enough to be believed, not enough to be inconvenient. She had expressed, with what Theron described as exactly calibrated reluctance, her willingness to honor my memory by serving the alliance between their packs. She's good, I said. Yes, he said. She is. Did she touch you? The question came out smaller than I intended. He looked at me with an attention that did not make me feel foolish for asking it. Twice, he said. Both times calculated. Once on the arm when making a point about pack strategy. Once when saying goodbye, her hand on mine for approximately 2 seconds. He paused. I thought about the look on your face when you told me she never did anything without a reason. Both times I felt nothing except the awareness of the calculation. I looked at the table. My father believed her completely? Your father is a man in profound grief who has been given a coherent story and no alternative. He believes her because he has to, not because the story is good. He leaned forward slightly. But your mother, I looked up. She did not believe the story, he said. I cannot tell you how I know this. It was nothing she said. It was everything she did not say. The way she sat outside the conversation rather than in it. The way she looked at Cressida when Cressida spoke about you. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother is watching and waiting for something. She does not know what. but she has not closed the door. I held that. I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are afraid of dropping, turning it slowly to examine all its surfaces. My mother, by the window, not mourning, watching. On the 5th day of Theron's visits to Silver Creek, he came back with something different in his face, something that had not been there before, something that he carried in through the back door along with the cold and the snow, and set down on the table between us with the care you use for things that need to be handled precisely. "Cressida asked me something today," he said. I waited. She asked whether the mate bond was real. He sat down, his hands flat on the table. She was careful about it, framed it as curiosity, as something she had heard and wondered about. She said, "I understand alpha kings can sometimes recognize their mate by scent, that the bond announces itself without warning. Is that true?" He looked at me steadily. And then she looked at me with eyes that were not curious at all. The silence in the cabin had a different quality than the silences before it. I felt it arrive, the full understanding of what he was telling me, not as a new piece of information, but as the final piece of a shape I had been looking at incompletely, the piece that made all the other pieces suddenly make sense. "She knew," I said. My voice was very level. She already knew. Before the cliff, she knew there was a possibility that the Alpha King might recognize a true mate, and she was afraid it would be me. I looked at the fire. That is not why she pushed me. She had reasons enough without that, but it is why she timed it when she did, why she moved when she did, why she did not wait. Why the night she chose was the night she heard the announcement about the new moon. I exhaled slowly. She was afraid of being passed over by fate itself, not just by our Father, by the actual mechanics of the universe. "Yes," Theron said. "That is what I think, too." I sat with that for a long time. There was something terrible in it, and something that was almost, not forgivable, never that, but almost comprehensible. Cressida had spent 25 years feeling invisible in ordinary light. The idea that there existed a form of selection she could not strategize or outperform, a bond that would bypass her entirely and land on the sister she had already lost everything to, and that this might be about to happen in the most public and permanent possible way. I did not forgive her. I want to be clear about that. Understanding the architecture of a wound does not obligate you to accept what was built from it. But I understood, in a way I had not quite understood before, how completely she had been lost before she ever stood at the edge of that cliff. "There is something else," Theron said. His voice had changed slightly, carrying the particular quality of information he had been deciding how to deliver. "Your mother approached me privately, after the formal visit ended while Cressida was speaking with your father. Marin came to me in the corridor, and she spoke very quickly, very quietly." He reached into his coat and placed something on the table between us. A small scrap of cloth, deep blue wool, frayed at the edges, with a marking pressed into it in dark ink, a crescent moon. She said, "My daughter who was lost has a birthmark behind her left ear, the shape of a crescent moon. She has had it since birth. If you find anyone with that mark, please remember that I am waiting." The room went very quiet. I reached up slowly and pushed my hair back from my left ear. Theron looked at the small dark mark behind it, the crescent shape I had lived with my entire life without ever considering it significant, and something moved through his expression that was not surprise. She knows, I said. She has known, he said, or suspected, since the beginning. She cannot say it. Cressida is beside her constantly, managing the household, managing the narrative. But she left you a door, watching. And now I knew what she had been watching for, waiting. I pressed my hand over my mouth for a moment. I breathed carefully through the pressure behind my eyes, the grief and the gratitude arriving together in a combination that was difficult to manage without expression. Then I lowered my hand and straightened and looked at Theron across the table. "How long until the ceremony?" I asked. 3 days, he said. "The new moon is in 3 days. Both packs will gather at Blood Moon Packlands. The ceremony is scheduled for moonrise." He paused. "Cressida believes she has won. She has every reason to believe it. I have given her no indication otherwise. 3 days." I thought about the silver dress Theron had brought back from Blood Moon on his last visit, folded carefully in paper, the color of my pack's marking, the color of moonlight, the color of things made visible in darkness. I thought about the words I would say when I walked into that ceremony. I had been composing them in my mind for 12 days, revising them, stripping them down to their essential weight. I thought about my mother's piece of blue wool with the crescent moon pressed into it, left in a stranger's hands like a letter slipped under a door. I thought about Cressida standing on a platform, certain that the story she had written was the only story left. "There's something I need to tell you," Bastian said from the corner where he had been sitting quietly through all of this, and both Theron and I turned to look at him. His expression was the expression of a man delivering the last piece of unwelcome news in a long sequence of unwelcome news. "The man in our council who has been sending messages to Silver Creek. I have a name." He said the name. Theron's jaw tightened fractionally. "He will be at the ceremony," Bastian said. "Whatever he has communicated to Silver Creek, whatever arrangement he believes he has made, he will be present when Riven walks in." "Good," Theron said quietly. He looked at me. I looked at him. 3 days between us, and everything that came next. That night, in the dark hours after Bastian had stopped pretending not to be asleep, I reached across the small space between our chairs and found Theron's hand. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine without looking up from the fire. "I'm afraid," I said, "not of the ceremony, not of Cressida, of something more specific than either of those things. I'm afraid of seeing their faces, my parents, when they see me walk in." He was quiet for a moment. The fire moved between us, warm and unhurried. "I know," he said. "That's all you have?" "The fear you're describing," he said, "is the fear of someone who loves people enough to understand exactly what they put them through, even when the putting through was not your fault." He looked at me then. "I don't think that fear goes away before the moment. I think it goes away during it." I held that. I held his hand. Outside the cabin, the night was very dark, 3 days from the new moon, the sky close and black and full of stars that had been there long before any of this and would be there long after. "In 3 days," I said. "In 3 days," he agreed. And we sat there in the firelight, the Alpha King and the dead girl who was not dead, counting down the hours until the world found out. Day 25. We left the cabin at first light. I did not look back at it when we left. I had considered whether I would, had anticipated the moment in the way you anticipate things you know will carry weight. But when it came, I simply walked forward through the snow toward where Bastian and the two escorts waited with horses at the tree line, and the cabin fell behind me, and I let it. What happened in that cabin was not something I needed to carry by looking backward at the building. It was already inside me, woven into whatever I had become over 25 days of healing and learning and sitting by a fire with a man who had found me dying in the snow and decided, for reasons that bypassed every rational calculation, that this was not acceptable. I carried it forward. That was the only direction available. Theron rode beside me through the first hour without speaking, and I was grateful for that, for the particular quality of his silence, which had never in the entire time I had known him felt like absence. It felt like presence, choosing not to fill itself with unnecessary sound. The forest moved around us, old growth giving way to younger trees as we traveled north and west. The territory shifting in the subtle ways that territories shift when you are paying attention. I was paying attention to everything. I had spent 12 days learning to pay attention differently, not the watchful, anxious attention of someone monitoring for threats and trying to make themselves smaller in advance of them, but the clear, forward-facing attention of someone who has decided what they are walking toward and wants to see it coming. The blood moon packlands announced themselves gradually, the trees thinning, cleared fields appearing between the forest edges, the smell of wood smoke from multiple fires, the particular dense warmth smell of a large community preparing for something significant. Then the pack house itself, visible from the last rise before the approach road, massive and very old, built from dark stone and timber that had been standing for generations and intended to stand for generations more. It was the largest structure I had ever seen. I kept my expression neutral and my posture straight, and I thought, in 2 days, this will be my home. The thought was not frightening in the way I might have expected. It was simply true, the way the shape of the building was true, present and waiting to be inhabited. Theron guided me through the approach along a track that ran behind the main building, away from the gathering activity of servants and arriving delegates and the organized chaos of ceremony preparation. He was back in his Alpha King presentation completely now, and I understood it better than I had at the cabin, understood that the contained formal quality he wore in public was not a lie, but a discipline. The same way the careful stillness he used in private was not coldness, but a choice. The private passages of the pack house were narrow and low lit, stone corridors that smelled of dust and old wood and the accumulated decades of a family that had lived in this building long enough to leave themselves into its walls. Theron knew every turn without thinking about it, and I followed him with my hand brushing the stone and thought about all the years of solitary walking these corridors represented. His rooms were on the east side of the building, the forest-facing side, high enough that the windows looked out over the tree line rather than into the courtyard. Large, simply furnished, the rooms of someone who had not bothered to make a space personal because they had never expected to share it. I stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, looking at the bookshelves that covered 2 full walls, the desk near the window buried in territorial correspondence, the chair by the unlit fireplace that had the specific worn quality of a chair used regularly and alone. "This is where you live," I said. "Yes. You read a great deal." "There is a great deal of time," he said, "in the evenings when you are Alpha King and have no one to talk to." I turned to look at him, He said it completely without self-pity, just as a fact about his life, but the fact landed in me with a weight that his even delivery did not diminish. "Not anymore," I said. Something moved through his expression, brief and very warm, before the formal quality resettled. "Not anymore," he agreed. Bastian arrived with the silver dress and with final instructions delivered in his usual economy. The ceremony would begin at moonrise, approximately 3 hours from now. The delegates from both packs were already gathering in the great courtyard below. Aldrich and Marin had arrived an hour ago. Cressida was in the guest quarters on the west side of the building, being attended to by the Silver Creek contingent. The traitor on the council, whose name was Fennick, a man of 50 with political ambitions that had apparently led him to bet on the wrong outcome, was present and seated in the council section of the ceremony grounds. "He'll be visible from the platform," Bastian said. "When things unfold, he'll have nowhere to go." "Good," Theron said. Bastian looked at me for a moment, and what passed across his face was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. The expression of a man who had reserved judgment for 25 days and had finally arrived at his conclusion. "My lady," he said, and left. I dressed alone. This was deliberate. I had thought about it, about the various ways the next hours could go, and I had decided that dressing for this needed to be something I did by myself, in silence, without assistance or witness. It was a private act of preparation, the putting on of not just fabric, but intention. The dress was silver, the deep, cool silver of moonlight rather than the thin silver of cheap cloth, and it moved with the particular weight of something well made. It was cut simply, which was right, nothing decorative, nothing designed to call attention to itself. The attention would be called by what I did in it, not by what it was. I looked at myself in the mirror on the back of the door. The woman looking back at me was not the woman who had stood before her mirror in Silver Creek Packhouse 25 days ago, braiding her hair for a morning that would end at the bottom of a cliff. She had the same silver hair, the same gray eyes, the same face. But the way the face held itself was different. The set of the jaw, the quality of the eyes, which had shed something in 25 days that I had not known I was carrying until it was gone. A constant, low-level apology for existing in the form I existed in. I was not apologizing for anything tonight. The scar on my left temple, still pink, still visible, caught the lamplight. Good. Let it be visible. Let everyone in that courtyard see exactly what had been done and to whom, and understand, before I said a single word, that I had survived it. I touched the crescent mark behind my left ear. My mother was somewhere in this building. 3 weeks of sitting by windows, waiting for something she could not name. I was here. I braided my hair back from my face and left the rest loose, the silver of it catching the lamp the way it caught moonlight, and I opened the door to find Bastian waiting in the corridor, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who is prepared for many significant events and recognizes when one is about to become the story that gets told for the next 20 years. "Ready?" he asked. I thought about the wolf pup in the snow with his broken leg and his yellow eyes and the way he had tested the bound leg before looking back at me, trusting the repair before he understood why he should. "Yes," I said. The sounds of the ceremony reached us before we reached the ceremony. The low collective voice of 500 wolves gathered in formal assembly, the particular resonant frequency of a large group awaiting something significant. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold, and the sharp, clean scent of pine torches burning along the courtyard walls. The new moon had risen, its absence making the torchlight the dominant light in the world, everything rendered in warm amber and deep shadow. Bastian led me through the lower passage, the one that opened behind the gathered crowd rather than before it. We paused at the door. Through the gap I could see the platform, elevated by 4 steps above the courtyard floor, ringed with torches that made it an island of brightness in the surrounding dark. Theron stood on it in formal ceremonial dress, the deep charcoal and gold of Blood Moon's colors, his posture carrying everything he was without effort. Beside him, positioned to his left, stood Cressida. I had not seen my sister in 25 days. She was wearing deep red, the color of blood and of ambition, the color of someone who had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary because she had already won. Her hair was elaborately arranged, her posture composed, her face wearing the expression I recognized from 22 years of watching her perform in public, gracious and slightly sorrowful, and entirely in control of the impression she was making. She stood on that platform as if she had been born to stand there. I felt something move through me that was not quite grief, and not quite fury, and not quite love, some compound of all three that had no name in any language I had ever learned. Then I found my parents in the front row. My father first, Aldrich, who had aged in 25 days in the way people age when grief is physical rather than emotional, when it settles into the bones and the posture rather than just the face. He was standing straight because he was alpha and would not do otherwise, but the straightness cost him. I could see it from here. The effort required to maintain the form when the content had been hollowed out. My mother. Marin stood beside him, with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes, even now, even in this formal assembly, not on the platform, on the edge of the crowd, on the entrances, on the places where something unexpected might arrive. 3 weeks of sitting by windows. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum and breathed. Then I nodded to Bastian. Theron's voice carried across the courtyard with the particular authority of a voice that had spent years making itself heard over difficult things, clear and formal, and carrying the weight of ceremony. By the ancient laws of our kind, he said, and in the presence of both our packs and our gathered witnesses, I invite Cressida of Silver Creek to accept the bond of Luna Queen, to stand beside me as partner and mate, to serve these people as their queen, and to bind our packs in lasting alliance. Cressida lifted her chin. Her expression arranged itself into something that managed to convey both humility and triumph simultaneously, a technical achievement I might have admired in different circumstances. Her lips were parting to speak. Stop. My voice came out of me like something that had been stored under pressure for 25 days and had finally found its release, clear and cold and carrying to every corner of the courtyard with a precision I had not planned but recognized as right. Stop this ceremony. 500 wolves turned. The silence was absolute. The particular silence of a large group of people who have just experienced something their minds have not yet caught up with, who are in the gap between perception and understanding. I walked forward. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, not with any coordinated movement, just the natural parting of people who see something coming toward them with sufficient certainty and step aside without thinking about it. The torchlight caught my dress and my hair and the scar on my temple, and I kept my eyes on the platform, and I did not stop walking. This ceremony is built on lies and on blood, I said, and my voice carried easily in the silence. And I am the proof. I heard my father before I saw his face change. A sound came out of him that was not a word, something below the level of language, a sound I had never heard from him before and would never forget. The sound of a man having something restored to him that he had given up on. I did not look at him yet. I could not look at him yet and maintain what I needed to maintain. I climbed the 4 steps to the platform. I stood before 500 people in silver that caught the torchlight, and I looked at my sister. Up close, she was not what I expected. I had constructed a version of her in my mind over 25 days that was all calculation and coldness, all the sharp edges of what she had done. And the woman standing before me was those things, yes, but she was also white-faced and shaking in a way she was not managing to control, and her eyes, looking at me, held something I had not anticipated. Not guilt, not yet. Terror. The terror of someone who has built an elaborate structure and is watching the foundation shift. Tell them, I said, quietly, just to her, just for a moment before the public part began. Tell them what happened at the cliff. I don't know what you're talking about. Her voice was high and thin, stripped of its usual precision. You were attacked. There were rogues. You must have hit your head. You're confused. You don't remember correctly. There were no rogues. I turned to face the crowd, because this was not a private conversation anymore, and had not been from the moment I walked in. There were no rogues, I said again, to all of them, to the assembled wolves of 2 packs, and the representatives of neighboring territories, and the council members, and the elders, and my father, who was holding himself up by what appeared to be pure will. And my sister knows it, because she was the only other person present. I heard Cressida's breathing change behind me. My name is Riven of Silver Creek. 25 days ago, my sister Cressida brought me to the cliff above the Eastern Valley, a place we had gone together since we were children. She told me the Alpha King was seeking a Luna, and that I would be chosen, and that she was tired. My voice stayed level. I had prepared these words for 25 days, and they came out exactly as I had shaped them. And then she pushed me off the cliff and walked home. The crowd erupted, not in the organized way of a response, but in the simultaneous, involuntary noise of 500 people receiving information that reorganizes something fundamental. It moved through the assembly like a physical thing, a wave, and then compressed back into something that was not quite silence, but was its cousin. Theron moved to my side. He did not speak. He simply stood beside me, his shoulder an inch from mine. And the message of that was louder than anything he could have said. Cressida made one more attempt. She's lying. She's been with him for weeks. They've arranged this. She's trying to steal. What should be yours? I turned back to her. Is that the next word? That's what you said at the cliff. That this should be yours. You don't understand, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the crack spreading up through the composed surface like ice splitting under pressure. You have never understood. Every day of my life, I watched people's faces change when you walked in. I watched our father look at you like you were the answer to something he hadn't known he was asking. I watched our pack say your name like it was a gift. The crack widened. Do you know what it is to be invisible next to someone? Not overlooked, not merely second. Invisible. as if the light goes to you and simply doesn't reach me. So you tried to kill me, I said. Not an accusation in the sharp sense, more the quiet closing of a door, the naming of a thing that needed to be named. I wanted it to stop. The words came out of her like something that had been held under extreme pressure and had finally found a crack to escape through. I wanted to stop waking up every morning and being less. I wanted one thing, one moment where something chose me instead of you. And when I heard about the Alpha King... She stopped. Her hands were shaking. I knew they would push you forward and I would be invisible again, and I couldn't do it again. The silence that followed was not the silence of condemnation, not entirely. It was more complicated than that, the silence of 500 people recognizing something in what she said, something about being overlooked and wanting to matter, before arriving at the place where recognition ended and what she had done began. My mother walked onto the platform. She came up the steps quietly, without announcement, a small woman in gray wool, and she crossed to where I stood, and she put both her hands on my face the way she had when I was very young, cupping my jaw, tilting my face toward her, and she looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "I knew." Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "I did not know what I knew," she said, turning slightly so that her voice reached the crowd without her leaving me. "But I knew the story was wrong. I have known since the first night when my daughter came home with scratches she put there herself, because I raised both of them, and I know the difference between what Cressida looks like when she has been hurt and what she looks like when she is performing." She looked at Cressida, and what was in her expression was not hatred, which would have been simpler. "I left a message for the Alpha King. I did not know if it would reach anyone. I did not know what else to do." She turned back to me. "You have your father's face," she said very quietly. And every morning for 25 days I sat by the window and waited for it. I held together, barely, by the specific determination of someone who has one more thing to do before she is allowed to fall apart. "Guards." Theron's voice was quiet and final, and did not require volume to carry absolute authority. Two of his largest warriors stepped forward from the sides of the platform. Cressida did not fight. Whatever had driven her to the cliff and through the weeks of performance that followed had spent itself in the last minutes, burned through by the weight of her own confession spoken aloud in front of everyone whose opinion she had been managing. She stood with her arms at her sides and her eyes on the platform floor. And when the guards came to stand beside her, she did not resist. She looked up once before they led her away, and she found my face. "I am sorry," she said. "For whatever it is worth now, I am sorry." I looked at my sister, at the face I had known my whole life, at the person who had braided my hair and told me stories, and then stood at the edge of a cliff and watched me fall. "I believe you," I said. "I don't know yet what I'll do with that, but I believe you." The guards led her from the platform, and the crowd parted for her as it had parted for me, and she walked out of the torchlight and into the shadow and was gone. My father reached the platform steps. I had been aware of him at the edge of my vision through all of it, standing in the front row with the stillness of a man who has received a shock too large to immediately process, who is managing it by staying very still and waiting for the world to stop moving. He climbed the steps slowly, And when he reached the platform and stood before me, his face was doing too many things at once for me to name all of them. He said my name. Just my name. The way Theron had said it in the cabin on that first day. Testing the weight of something you are not sure you are allowed to have again. I stepped forward and his arms came around me and he held on with the particular intensity of someone who has been told they cannot have a thing and then been given it back unexpectedly, as if he was afraid that releasing the grip would return us to the previous version of reality. His whole body was shaking. "Papa," I said into his shoulder. He made a sound that was not a word, the same sound I had heard when I walked in, the sound below language, and I felt it in my own chest as an echo. We stood there on the platform in front of 500 people, and I let him hold on for as long as he needed, because 25 days of grief was 25 days of grief, regardless of whose fault it was or was not. And some things need to be felt completely before they can be set down. Eventually, he loosened his hold enough to look at me, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes moving over my face with a thoroughness that was recognizing and relearning simultaneously. His eyes found the scar on my temple. His jaw tightened. "I didn't know," he said. "Riven, I didn't know. I thought I knew my daughters. I thought I understood what was in my own house." "You couldn't have known," I said. "She was very careful. She had been careful for a long time. I should have seen." "Perhaps," I said, "but the seeing is not what matters now." He looked at me for another moment. Then he looked at Theron, standing to my left, and the two men regarded each other with the particular formality of men who are each in possession of something the other values and are arriving at a mutual understanding of what that means. "You found her," Aldrich said. "She found herself," Theron said. "I was simply in the vicinity." My father looked at the way Theron was standing relative to me, the specific quality of proximity that carries information beyond what words communicate, and he understood it. He looked at me to confirm, and I met his eyes, and did not look away. He nodded once, slowly, with the weight of a man accepting something that is simultaneously a loss and a gift, and has the grace to recognize both qualities at once. Then he turned to the crowd, the Alpha of Silver Creek, and he said in the voice that carried authority, not through volume, but through the weight of what stood behind it, "My daughter lives. The woman who has stood before you tonight and spoken the truth is Riven of Silver Creek, and she is owed the acknowledgement of everyone in this territory who accepted a lie in her place." The council member, Fennec, tried to leave his seat when the guards turned toward him and found that the two men flanking him had anticipated this with the efficiency of people who had been watching him since before the ceremony began. He was escorted from the grounds with a quietness that was more effective than drama would have been, the quietness of consequences arriving without announcement. Bastian watched this from the edge of the platform and permitted himself a small, satisfied nod. Then Theron turned to me. The ceremony ground held its breath. He went down on one knee. The Alpha King of Blood Moon Pack, the most powerful man in the territory, on one knee on the platform where he had been about to bind himself to someone else, before 500 witnesses and the torchlight and the dark new moon sky. "I found you dying in the snow," he said. "You survived. You healed. You planned and waited and walked into this courtyard tonight and told the truth to everyone who needed to hear it." He looked up at me from the knee, his amber eyes carrying everything he was without the containment, without the careful management, Just Theron looking at Riven in front of everyone. I did not save you. You were never mine to save. But I would very much like to stand beside you, if you will have me, for all the things that come next. He rose. He held out his hand, palm up, a question made physical. I looked at his hand. I looked at his face. I looked at the 500 people watching, at my father with tears on his face, at my mother who had sat by windows for 25 days and never stopped waiting. Then I placed my hand in his. Yes, I said, to the hand and the man and the life and the next thing and the thing after that. Yes, to all of it. And somewhere in the crowd, someone began to bow. Then the person beside them. Then the next. The ceremony that followed was not the ceremony that had been planned. There were no elaborate speeches, no formal recitations of alliance terms, no carefully orchestrated presentation of a Luna chosen from a catalog of suitable daughters. What happened instead was simpler and more permanent than any of those things. Two people standing before their packs in the torchlight of a new moon night and speaking words that had not been written in advance, that came from somewhere below preparation, from the place where the truth lives before it becomes language. Theron spoke first. He did not reach for formality or ceremony. He spoke the way he spoke in the cabin when there was no one to perform for, directly and without decoration, looking only at me. I have been Alpha King for 5 years, he said, and in those 5 years, I have sat through more formal introductions and carefully arranged meetings than I can accurately count, each one designed to show me someone worth choosing. Not one of them showed me anything I did not already expect to see. He paused. I found you in the snow, dying, and I chose to stay because my wolf recognized something my mind had not yet caught up with. What I know now, standing here, is that everything I learned about you in the weeks that followed, your stubbornness and your precision and your capacity to feel grief for the person who tried to destroy you, is not incidental to who you are. It is who you are, and I choose it, all of it, without reservation. The courtyard was very quiet. I had not prepared words. I had prepared arguments and confrontations and the specific measured sentences required to dismantle a lie in public. I had not prepared this. So I said what was true. You saw me, I said. Not the version of me that existed to reflect someone else's light, not the daughter or the sister or the beautiful one or any of the other shapes I had been asked to hold. You saw me when I was broken and bleeding and barely present, and you stayed anyway, and you kept staying, and the person I became in that cabin is not who I was before. Because before, I did not know that being seen was something that was available to me. I looked at him steadily. I want to be that person, the one who knows. I want to be her beside you. The binding was simple. Hands joined before witnesses. The words of the old form spoken by the pack elder who had come forward from the blood moon contingent, his voice carrying the particular resonance of someone performing an act they have performed many times, but recognize as different this time, weighted differently, earned differently. When it was done, when the elder had spoken the final words, and the bond between us clicked into place, with a certainty I felt in the marrow of my bones, Theron raised my joined hand above us and turned us both to face the assembled packs. 500 wolves bowed. I had not expected to feel what I felt in that moment. I had expected relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of a plan completed and a truth told, and justice arrived at after a long journey. What I felt instead was something quieter and more disorienting, something that took me a moment to identify because I had so little experience of it. I felt at home, not in the place, in the standing, in the being present in my own skin without apology or subtraction, without the constant low-level effort of making myself smaller so that someone else could feel larger. Just standing, just here, just Riven. My mother reached me before anyone else, moving through the dispersing crowd with the directness of a woman who has been patient long enough and has finished with patience for the evening. She took my face in her hands again, and this time she did not say anything for a long time, just looked, her eyes moving over every feature with the thoroughness of someone verifying something they have needed to verify for 25 days. Then she pulled me into her arms and held on. She was smaller than I remembered. I had been remembering her at a size appropriate to childhood. When mothers are large and foundational and seem to contain the whole world within their dimensions. She was small and warm, and she smelled of the lavender she pressed between her linens, which was the smell of my whole childhood, and I pressed my face into her shoulder and allowed myself, finally, to be her daughter without the complicated weight of everything that came with it. I knew, she said again into my hair. I did not know how or where, but I knew you were somewhere. I could not close the door. You left a message, I said. Theron told me. The cloth. The mark. She pulled back enough to look at my face. It was the only thing I could think of. She was always there, always watching me, always managing what I was allowed to say and who I was allowed to say it to. She touched the scar on my temple with 2 careful fingers, the same gesture Theron had used in the cabin on the first day I was coherent, and the similarity of it moved through me like a note struck twice on the same string. I should have protected you better. Long before this, I should have seen what was building. You could not have stopped it, I said. It had been building since before either of us understood what it was. She looked at me for a moment, and in her eyes I saw the specific grief of a mother who has lost something she cannot recover and is learning to hold the loss alongside the survival, which is its own particular work. Your father, she said. He was standing at the edge of the platform, talking with Theron in the low-voiced, deliberate way of 2 people conducting the first careful exchange of a relationship that will need to become functional, feeling out the language and the terms. My father's posture had changed from what it had been when I walked in, still carrying weight, because grief does not resolve in an evening, but carrying it differently, the way you carry something when you know it is the last of it, rather than the beginning. He looked up and found me watching him, and for a moment his face did the thing it had always done, the lighting up, the involuntary warmth, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel the complicated shadow of that expression, the awareness of who was watching from the corridor, the guilt of being the recipient of something that came at a cost I had not asked to impose. There was no one watching from the corridor anymore. I crossed to him, and he put his hand on the back of my head the way he had when I was small, not holding, just present, and I leaned into it for a moment and let it be simple. Theron, he said, his voice rough with everything the evening had moved through him, is a man I can respect. He is, I agreed. He looked at you tonight, my father said, the way I looked at your mother the first time I understood what she was. Like she was the answer to a question he had been asking for years without knowing what the question was. He paused. I should have made sure both my daughters knew that look was possible. that it existed and was available, and did not belong exclusively to beauty or to birth order or to anything that could be envied or taken. I was quiet for a moment. Cressida would have needed to believe it about herself, I said. That was the part that could not be given to her. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man accepting a truth that offers no comfort, but is a truth regardless. 3 days after the ceremony, the council of both packs convened. The proceedings were formal and documented and lasted the better part of a morning. Testimonies were recorded. The laws pertaining to violence between pack members, to the abuse of alpha authority, to the deliberate deception of a ruling alpha king, were consulted and cited and applied with the careful deliberateness that serious consequences require when they are going to outlast the moment. The sentence was banishment, complete and permanent, stripped of rank, stripped of pack affiliation, the formal severing of every tie that bound Cressida to Silver Creek or to Blood Moon, or to any pack that recognized the authority of either. She would leave with enough provisions for 10 days of travel. She would not return. Any pack in the territory that chose to take her in would do so knowing her history in full, with the complete documentation of what she had done and what had been decided because of it. When they brought Cressida before the assembled council for the reading of the decree, she looked like someone who had already understood what was coming and had used the intervening days to arrive, if not at peace, then at something that was not fighting it. She stood straight. She listened to her father read the terms without expression. When he finished, she said, clearly and without qualification, that she understood. Then she looked at me, where I sat beside Theron at the council table. I thought, she said, that if I had what you had, I would stop feeling the way I felt. I understand now that the thing I was feeling was not about you. You were just the surface I could see it on. She paused. That does not make what I did to you smaller. I am not offering it as mitigation. I am offering it because I think you deserve the truth, and it is the last true thing I can give you. I looked at my sister for a long moment, at the face I had known from the beginning of my memory, at the intelligence in her eyes that had always been there and had never found the application it deserved, at the lines of exhaustion that 25 days of pretending and 3 days of waiting had cut into her face. I hope you find somewhere, I said, where the light reaches you. I mean that without conditions. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and turned and walked out with the guards, and the door closed behind her. And that was the last time I saw my sister. Fennec's proceedings were handled the following afternoon in a smaller room with fewer witnesses, which suited the nature of what he had done. Treason from within a council is a different crime than treason from without. It is quieter and more corrosive, the kind that does its damage in corridors and in carefully worded messages sent to the wrong people, and it deserved to be treated with the same quiet it had operated in. The council stripped him of his seat. His lands within Blood Moon territory were reassigned. His access to any formal pack assembly, any council chamber, any position of influence within the territory was revoked for a period no shorter than 20 years, which at his age amounted to a permanent removal from the world he had spent his life building. He was permitted to remain in the territory as a private citizen, which Theron told me later had been the subject of some debate among the council members who wanted harsher terms. His reasoning was simple and characteristically direct. Exile makes a man a martyr to those who shared his ambitions. stripping him of everything he valued and making him watch the consequences of his choices from a distance, was a more complete punishment than sending him somewhere he could not see what he had lost. Bastian reported 3 days after the proceedings that Fennec had been seen at the market in the lower settlement, buying provisions like any ordinary man. He had kept his eyes down the entire time. No one had spoken to him. Good, I thought, when Bastian told me. Let him live in it. Dawn came the following morning, quiet and unhurried, the way dawns come when the world has finished with its drama and resumed its ordinary work. I was awake before the light, which was not unusual, standing at the window of Theron's rooms that were now also my rooms, looking out at the forest that spread below and east and in all directions as far as I could see, the trees dark against the sky that was just beginning its first pale movement toward dawn. I heard his footsteps behind me, and then his warmth was at my back, his arms coming around my waist, his chin resting at my temple. We stood like that in silence for a moment, watching the light change. "She left an hour ago," he said. He had received the report from the gate guard, I understood, the quiet logistics of consequence being implemented. "The Eastern Road." I nodded. I had known it was coming, and I let myself feel it simply. The loss of what had never quite existed alongside the reality of what had been done, holding both without needing to resolve them into something simpler. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not a formality. "I will be," I said. I think that is the most honest answer. His arms tightened slightly. "That is enough." We watched the dawn arrive in full, the sky moving through its gradations from black to gray to the particular pale gold of winter morning. And then I saw it, at the tree line below the window, a small figure at the edge of the forest. The wolf pup. He was larger than he had been, filled out in the week since I had found him in the trap, his winter coat fully grown, his leg bearing his weight without compensation. He stood at the precise boundary between the forest and the cleared ground, looking up at the window with the same yellow-eyed directness he had looked at me with when I crouched in the snow beside him. The look of a creature assessing whether a thing can be trusted. I pressed my hand flat against the cold glass. He held still for another moment, those yellow eyes steady and serious. Then he turned and walked back into the trees and was gone, his small dark shape swallowed by the forest in 3 steps. And then there was nothing but the trees and the morning light. "What was that?" Theron asked. "A patient I released," I said. He came back to say goodbye. I felt him look at me. "Or," I said, "he came back to say something else. That things that have been hurt can heal. That what you send back into the world carrying your care does not always go away permanently." I watched the place between the trees where he had disappeared. I am not sure which. Perhaps both. Behind me, the room was warming as the fire Theron had built began to establish itself. Somewhere in the building, the morning sounds of a large household coming to life were beginning, the distant particular noise of a community waking into its work. My community now. I thought about what that meant and found that the thinking was not frightening, was not even particularly daunting. It was simply the next thing, the first of many next things, stretching forward in a direction I could not see to its end, but could see clearly enough for the distance immediately ahead. That was enough. Theron turned me gently from the window, his hands at my waist, and I turned and looked at him in the morning light, at the amber eyes that had found me in the dark, and decided, without adequate reason, that this was not acceptable, that I would not be left there. "What do you want?" he asked, "for this morning? Not the politics or the duties or the things that need to be decided. This morning, before all of that." I thought about it. "Breakfast," I said, "and the books. I want to look at your library properly. I have been looking at those shelves for 2 days, and I need to know what is in them." He smiled. The smile that transformed his face, that moved through the stern angles of it like light through a window that has been closed too long. And I thought, as I had thought the first time I saw it in the cabin, that it was perhaps the most significant thing about him, that this existed inside the containment, that it was there and available and real. "The library," he said, "has been waiting for someone to use it properly for approximately 5 years. "Then we have wasted enough time," I said. We went to breakfast. We went to the library. Outside the window, the forest held its quiet. The trees standing in their patient rows, the snow covering the ground in its indifferent white, covering everything equally, the wounds and the recoveries alike. The forest outside was very still, the kind of still that belongs to mornings after large things have been settled. That night, I stood at the window one more time before sleep, looking out at the dark where the tree line was invisible against the sky, where somewhere beyond my sight, my sister was walking a road she had chosen by choosing what she chose. I placed my hand on the cold glass. From somewhere very far away, a wolf howled, single note, long and clear, carrying through the cold air with the particular quality of a sound that has no audience and is not looking for one, just a thing expressing its own existence into the dark. I listened until it faded. Then I turned away from the window and went back into the warm room where Theron was reading by the fire, and I sat beside him, and I picked up the book I had left on the table, and I read. I had survived the thing that tried to bury me. I had grown toward the light. That was not the ending. It was the beginning, finally, of something that was entirely mine.